Well, we're standing against oppression and Sharia and the indoctrination of young people in the wind and the rain. What a perfect day for a protest. I feel like the charge of the light brigade here. We've got protesters to the right of us, protesters to the left of us, protesters in front of us volleying and thundering. This is actually my first protest. I've watched protests, I've recorded protests, but I've never actually participated in a protest before. When there are lots of people crammed in an area shouting, I kind of freak out and want to leave, so I've avoided protests for most of my life. But I'm making an exception, and let me explain why. Years ago in college, my best friend was a Pakistani Muslim. We were best friends for years. We spent years as best friends, and Nabil's family had come to the U.S. from Pakistan because their sect of Islam was persecuted by other sects of Islam. Why was his sect of Islam persecuted? Because in Surah 9, verse 73 of the Quran, Allah commands Muslims to wage jihad not only against unbelievers, but also against hypocrites, Muslims who aren't following Islam correctly. And for 14 centuries, Muslim groups have been labeling other Muslim groups hypocrites and persecuting them. When the persecuted minorities have a chance to flee, they flee. So Nabil's family came to the United States. Nabil tried to convince me that Islam is true. He tried to convert me to Islam. And he offered me a number of arguments to show me that Islam is true. But I had a habit. Anytime someone tried to present me with evidence, I wanted to read it for myself. So I started buying his sources, buying the hadith, buying the commentaries, and so on. And when I started looking at what his sources said, I started going back to him saying, this is very different from what you told me. You told me Muhammad was the greatest man who ever lived. Let's look at what your own sources say. You told me about the Quran. Let's look at what your sources actually say. After a few years, Nabil left Islam. He became a Christian. And when Nabil became a Christian, I thought to myself, cool, I'm done with Islam. Because the only reason I was studying Islam was that my best friend was a Muslim trying to convince me that Islam is true and telling me that the truth is found in his sources. That's why I was studying Islam. So I was done with Islam, had no other interest in it. It took Nabil about a month. He wasn't even making his conversion public, but it took about a month for Nabil to get his first death threat for leaving Islam. It was attached to his car. This wasn't online, it was attached to his car. So this was a person who knew how to find Nabil. Now, why was my best friend threatened with death for leaving Islam? Because Muhammad commanded in Sahih al-Bukhari 69:22, if anyone leaves his Islamic religion, kill him. And here one of the geniuses will say, but I have a Muslim friend and he doesn't kill apostates, so Islam doesn't teach that. Oh my goodness. I have news for the lovely group to the left here. Your Muslim friend is not, has never been, and never will be an authoritative source of Islamic doctrine or practice. Islam is defined by Allah and Muhammad. Your nice Muslim friend can follow the commands of Allah and Muhammad, or they can reject the commands of Allah and Muhammad, but under no circumstances do they define what the commands are. Those commands are defined. That's why Nabil was under a sentence of death. That's why he was being threatened, and they support it. So, why was he threatened but not actually killed? He wasn't killed because we aren't under Sharia. We don't have the legal system in place to carry out the penalty. Some follower of Muhammad might always do what it says anyway, might take matters into his own hands and decide to carry out the penalty himself, but he'll go to jail for it. He'll go to jail for it. If the legal system were in place, if we were actually under Sharia, there would be no penalty for killing Nabil. He would be killed by the government. So I realized there's a system in place, a system that calls for the death of my best friend. What do? Do I keep quiet about it and hope that as Islam spreads, no one ever decides to carry out what Muhammad said about my best friend? Fortunately, I was born with something called a spine, so I had to say a few things. And when I started criticizing Islam, questioning the ideology that calls for the death of my best friend, a former Muslim, two interesting things happened. One, when I started sharing my reasons for criticizing Islam, a lot of other people started leaving Islam. When I started putting the reasons out there, I kept hearing from Muslims, wow, I never heard from any of this. I never heard about any of this information you're sharing from my family, from my imam, from our scholars. They don't tell us any of this now that we know we're leaving Islam. Now notice, those people are also under a death penalty. So now I have not just my best friend, but all of these other people who have left Islam, they're all under a death penalty. What do? Do I keep quiet about the legal system that calls for their deaths? Can't do it. The other interesting thing that happened was that I started getting death threats. And why was I getting death threats? Well, the penalty for criticizing Islam, that falls under the Sharia blasphemy laws, and the penalty on me was death. And I got piles of messages from people telling me all the creative ways they're going to kill me and rape my mother and rape my wife and enslave my children. Now, why were those the claims? Because that's what you do to people like me under Sharia. That's the legal system. That's what it says. That's what the books say. So now I was under a death sentence. My friends were under a death sentence. My wife and children are being threatened. And what should I do here? Well, fast forward to today, where someone, a vocal proponent, a vocal defender and advocate of this system, a legal system that calls for my death, for Pamela's death, for all of your violent subjugation, is being promoted at the City University of New York. And what's amazing is that if you ask Linda Sarsour why people protest, I've seen people ask her, why do people protest you? She says, it's because I'm an empowered woman and because I wear the hijab. There are places in the world that have problems with empowered women. Places like Saudi Arabia. They do not like empowered women. That is not the United States of America. I will be going to see Wonder Woman on opening night. As for what Linda wears on her head, there are people who care. I couldn't conceivably care less if she wore a space helmet. I don't care what she wears on her head. So the reason she's giving for why people would object to what she's saying on college campuses, the reason people have a problem is Sharia. She's promoting Sharia. She's going to students, and after their minds have been prepared in the soil of higher education, she comes along and plants the idea that Sharia is a good thing. That's what she tells people. America, she says, was founded on the values of genocide and slavery, and that's why Sharia is better. Now, why that's ironic is, if you read the Muslim sources, Islam, Sharia, was founded on genocide and slavery. But what was America actually founded upon? The founding fathers of our country had a very scientific approach. They looked to history. They looked to the greatest sources of oppression in history, of rulers oppressing people, of people not having the basic freedom to speak their minds. They looked at the sources of misery and oppression, and they said, we're going to make a government that doesn't involve these sorts of things. And because of that, we've been allowed to make progress. So all of the problems we face, we're actually able to make progress. We had slavery. Slavery was a problem. Guess what? We have a system in place that allows us to abolish slavery and make progress. Women not having the right to vote. That was a problem. Our system allows us to abolish that and to make progress. Racial segregation was a problem. We have a system in place that allows us to make progress. There are places in the world who have been dealing with the same problems for the past 14 centuries because their legal systems do not allow them to make 1 inch of progress. And that happens to be the legal system Linda Sarsour believes needs to replace ours. And I find that utterly ridiculous. But think about this. There is this idea that Sharia would help. Who would Sharia help here? Where would Sharia make someone's life better? Would Sharia be good for women? No! That's half the population. Would Sharia be good for women? No! Under Sharia, we would have to bring back polygamy. It's perfectly legal under Sharia to have sex with prepubescent girls. You can beat your wife into submission if she gets out of line. You can take female sex slaves. You can rape your female captives. All of this under Sharia. So I would say that Sharia would not be good for at least half of the population there. What about other people? What about Christians? Would Sharia be good for Christians? Under Sharia, Christians can't preach the gospel, can't wear crosses, can't build new churches. If you spring a leak in your church, you're not allowed to repair your churches, and you have to pay tribute money to the Muslim rulers called jizya. I don't want to live like that. What about Jews? Would Sharia be good for Jews? Now, theoretically, Jews are allowed the opportunity to pay the jizya and not be killed, but since Muhammad said that the end will not come until Muslims fight the Jews, so that Jews are hiding behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees are crying out, "There's a Jew behind me, come kill him," since that is institutionalized doctrine in Islam, I don't think it's going to work out very well for Jews. What about Hindus and Buddhists and atheists and agnostics? Well, they're actually worse off than Christians and Jews because they don't even have the jizya option. They can't live as subjugated people. The message to them is convert or die. What about Muslims? Would Sharia be good for Muslims? Well, that kind of depends on which Muslim group wins, because whichever ones don't win, they're going to be violently subjugated and killed as well. So we have a system here that doesn't seem to be good for anyone except a very certain kind of people. If you want to violently subjugate people, if you want to chop off heads and fingers and hands, if you want to enforce these systems, if you want to beat your wife, if you want 4 wives, if you want sex slaves, if you want to be able to rape your female captives, if you want to enslave populations of people, well then, Sharia can help you accomplish your goals. But the people who want that sort of thing are not the sort of people who should be making legal systems for anyone. Now, with all of that said, I'm not really here about Linda Sarsour. I'm here about CUNY. City University of New York, of all the people in all the country, in all the world that they could have gotten to give the final send-off, to give the final marching orders to the graduating class, they chose someone who advocates a legal system that calls for my death, calls for the violent subjugation of all of you, that calls for the deaths of my friends, and this is what they came up with. I'm going to say this, I'm not going to condemn CUNY for that. I'm going to thank them for their honesty. They're not even trying to cover it up anymore, what they're doing on college campuses, right? For years we knew what they were doing, but they wouldn't actually admit it, they would deny it. Now we're actually seeing that students are brainwashed for years, wipe their minds clean, and then train them only to listen to certain kinds of people. Only listen to people like Linda Sarsour. Don't listen to people who actually pull out the sources and can read, because you know, literacy is Islamophobic. And so they trained them for years to only listen to people like Linda Sarsour, and then the final send-off, the final marching orders from the university is go with Sharia. And so I don't condemn CUNY. I thank you, City University of New York, for finally showing us your true colors.